Welcome to the studio for Chapter 25 on HTTP and forms. Today we're going to build a search engine, or at least a gateway to several search engines that is going to be a very simple form that will allow someone to put in a search term and then have 4 choices: Google, DuckDuckGo, Bing, and Ask, and then a button to submit the form. And then whatever search term they've given and whichever search engine they've chosen, it will go directly to that search engine's website and provide the search results, all in one click of a button. So we're going to use the knowledge that you now have about HTTP requests and forms to put all of this together. So this, has a little bit of a discussion here about GET and POST, how you can choose to use GET for basic searches because you're just retrieving data, you're not changing it or saving anything on a server. So you really have the choice of doing either. And they also talk about why they chose the name Q for the search box, because we can use that for some of these search engines that also use Q as their parameter. So the first thing that you want to do is fork this from LaunchCode's repository. Make sure you have your own copy in your own GitHub account, and then clone that to your local machine and move into the directory. And then you can open that up in VS Code, and you should see something that looks like this. You have a simple index file for the project that just gives you a head with a couple of script tags here to provide the JavaScript right here in the file. Now, you may have learned in class that ordinarily it's not done this way. You have a separate script file and you would just link to it with the source attribute on the script file. And that's true, but just for the purpose of keeping this assignment all in one file, they have provided it just for you to do it this way, just for this assignment. So we're just going to code all of our JavaScript right here in the head and between the script tags. And then in the body, this is where we're going to actually build the form itself and any other elements we might decide to add to the page during the bonus mission. So let's go back and look at the instructions here. We are going to create the form inputs first, and then we will come down and actually work on the handler that we're going to write for submit and the functionality required for that. To set the action attributes so that the form knows where to submit it to, which website of the 4 that we're going to offer. And then we will make sure the handler is registered so that it, after the page loads, that's important. And then at the very bottom, you've got the bonus missions where we will add some validation to make sure the user doesn't try to submit something without having selected a search engine and entered something other than a blank, field for that search term. And we will prevent the form from submitting until they've done both of those things. The second one is to add some CSS rules to the page to make it look nice. So I've got some stuff that we'll do there at the very end to accomplish both of those. All right, so we are here. We're going to first create these form inputs, and they tell us that the options here, we want to use specific values for those options, and then this is ultimately the URL that will be the action that's provided for the form. So the first thing they want us to do is to create a text input with the form and set its name attribute to the value Q. Okay, so they've already given us a form. They've given us an ID for that form, which we can use, or we can just use the form tag, either way. And then you can also, something that I would like to do is to add target equals underscore blank to make sure that it opens the search in a different tab. Rather than just replacing the page with the form. That's a personal choice, totally up to you, not required. Okay, so we're going to add these form elements. Within the form, we need first let's go back and check these directions again. The text input, and we want the name attribute to be set to the value Q. So this is where the search term goes. So we'll have an input type equals text. Oh goodness, I keep forgetting. VS Code automatically puts both quotes in there for me. And we'll set the ID to Q. And the name to Q. May or may not need both, but we'll see. And then for now, let's just continue with the remainder of the inputs. So it tells us here we can create a radio group with one radio button for each search engine. And so they remind us here that radio buttons with the same name are grouped. That means that they're mutually exclusive. If you click on one and select it, the other one you may have clicked on before will be deselected. You can only have one selected at a time. So that's why it's important that they all have the same name. And they want us to give it the name engine. So let's do this. We've got our text input. Now we're going to go ahead and add input type equals radio, and then name equals engine. And each one needs to have a separate value, right? And they told us up in that chart what they wanted these values to be. So we can just use these values directly. So I'll give the first one the value Google. And then the input is a self-closing tag. So I'm just going to close it like that. And the other thing about this is, number 3 tells us to create a label element for each radio button. To make things easier on myself, I'm going to go ahead and skip to that step for this so I can do it all at once and then copy this to create the other 3. Now, there's different ways to do this. You can do the labels in front of it or after it. You can surround the input with the labels, which is actually how I'm going to choose to do it. When you do it this way, then you don't really need to tell the browser which label goes with which input if it's surrounding it. Otherwise, you can use the for attribute to specify which one it belongs to. But in this case, I'm going to wrap it, and then I want the button itself to be first. And then in between here, I'm going to add the label Google so that it appears after it. Now, one thing that I have failed to do is to actually start this up with live server so that we can see what we're doing. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to right click here. I've got the live server extension installed, and I'm going to say open with live server. And then over here, we see our text input we've created and our first radio button. So far, so good. I could click in this and, type in launch code and delete it back out. You can select this button. So we're good. So I'm going to create 3 more of these. I'm just going to copy that line down and then just change the values here. So if we go back to our instructions, we can see the values are DuckDuckGo and camel case, and then Bing and ask. So let's go do that. DuckDuckGo. And then Bing. And then ask. I am old enough to remember when this used to be Ask Jeeves. Okay, I have a little picture of a butler. Okay, so yeah, now we have all 4 radio buttons. And again, because we want them to be a group where they're mutually exclusive, we've given them all the exact same name, engine. And I can prove that by clicking on one, and then when I click on another, it only lets me select one at a time. So this is what we're going for. And if you ever find yourself in the position where you are clicking and you're able to select more than one at a time, but you intend for them to be only one at a time, just go back and check those names. Make sure you have the name set exactly the same on all of them. That's how it knows it's a group. Okay, so I've done my labels. I've done the buttons themselves. Let's go back to the instructions. The last thing is to add a submit button to the form and set its value to go. Okay, so we'll just on the next line here within the form, I'm going to put a button, and I'm going to give it an ID for my own purposes. Give it a value. Go. And actually, like if you wanted to be absolutely sure that this was, a submit button for the form, you could put type equals submit on it as well. It defaults to be the submit button for the form, even if you have more than one, I think. So then if you do have more than one, like a cancel button or something like that, you would need to specify the type, that they're not all supposed to be submit buttons. But in this case, we don't even need to do that because it's the only button, and we do want it to be used as a submit button. Okay, so now we look over just to do a reality check here, and we see our button go. Okay, so I can click on stuff. I could even put in a search term and say, lunch code, and I can say go, but nothing happens. We just get the page being refreshed. And that's because we haven't wired up an action for the form for the HTTP request. So we're actually going to need to do that with the JavaScript, because we can't hard code an action here because we don't yet know which one we want. It depends on which one they've selected. So instead, we're going to take advantage of the DOM, because we can create an object that stands in and represents this form. And then we can assign the action attribute using the property of the JavaScript object and give it that value of whichever one of the URLs we actually want to select based on the value of this. Okay, so let's come on down, and yeah, this is pretty much what I was just talking about. They do say here, we want to make sure to set that value after they hit the submit button, but before it's sent. And so we're going to control that with JavaScript to make sure we intercept the submit event, and then get the value from the button, and then use that to determine which action, and then set that action. And then when the browser does what it naturally does and submits it, it'll have the correct URL. So that's where we're headed. But we need to write some code before we can set that. So first thing to do is to create and register a handler. Now, a handler is just another name for, the function that you may apply on an event listener. Basically say, when this event happens, this is how I want you to handle it. And of course, we know when we have these event listeners that the syntax allows us to specify the event as a string and then give it a function. So we're going to have a load listener first, just to make sure the page is loaded before we put a listener on the form and listen for the submit event. So we're going to have a listener inside a listener. And they have this here in the code for us already. Pardon VS Code, it's showing me lots of things. Okay, so we have this here. It says create a handler and add an event. Now they've got this to do up here, which indicates they want us to create a function. This is one way to do it. We also could create it as an anonymous function, but let's go ahead. They want us to create it here and actually call it set search engine. We're going to make a named function. So I'm going to do that first and say function set search engine. And we'll just define it right here. So even though we aren't writing the code for this yet, we're going to go ahead and just do this to test it. We'll just say I clicked the button, because the idea is that when we submit, this should run. So we need to actually put the handler down here. And in order to do that, we need an object for the form. So I'm going to say const form equals, and then we can do document dot, we could do query selector and use the form. We can also do get element by ID. This does have an ID of search form, so we could certainly do it that way. Otherwise, we could do query selector and just give it form, because you could also select it just based on the type of tag that it is. Either will work. So if you did it one way versus the other, that's totally cool. So once we have the form, then we can create a listener for it. So I'm going to say, form.add event listener. We want to listen for that submit event, and then Here's the part that is important. You want to give it this handler function that we're going to define above. So I'm going to say set search engine, and notice that I did not call it. I merely referenced it. This is just pointing to this and saying, this is the function that I want you to run whenever this event happens. You're setting this up so it can happen. You're not calling it. You're not making it happen. That's the whole point of a listener, is it's passive. It just waits for that submitted event to be detected by the browser. And then it runs the function that's defined up here. Okay. So we can test this out now. Come back over here, and if I click this button, it's refreshing the page, and then it's doing away with that. And you'll notice it's also, because I set that target equals blank, it's creating like a billion of these, right? So this is where, in order to actually stop the browser from refreshing the page, we need to have an event.prevent default, just for now, so we can actually see what happens. So let me open this back up. Okay, we're in the console. I hit go. There we go. I clicked the button. So essentially what I just did is I just made it to where when it submits, it won't automatically refresh the form. Instead, it stays where it is and allows us to see what happened with that console log. So we've definitely proven, for now, all we've done is proven that our listener has been set up on that form to where when we submit the form with the button, it does run this function. That's all we needed to do for now. Okay, I can get rid of this now that we've tested it, and we'll go back and see what we need to do next. All right, so the next thing to do is to set the action. So here's the thing. We have 4 different URLs that we need to, associate with the button that they've chosen, these radio buttons with the name engine. So there's a special syntax here that they provided for you, because it's not anything we've taught you, where you can use query selector, document.query selector, and then give it this. You say, go to the input that has the name equal engine, and we have 4 of these, right? But it's saying only return the one that is checked, or checked is true behind the scenes. And that means, the one that we have selected. So if one of these has actually been clicked on, like right now, this particular one dot checked is true. And if I switch to this one, then this one is where checked is true. So all of that is already built into the functionality of these buttons in the browser by the nature of the way that the HTML, these input elements work. And so all we have to do is tap into it. So really, we just need a single variable that goes and uses this and retrieves whichever one was checked. And then we only need one object. We don't need objects for all 4 of them. Because we're going to use this to specifically narrow down which one has been checked. And every time this function runs, it will do this again. So let's come into here, and we will say, const button selected, I'm going to call it, so we know which one is which. So that we know what it represents is what I'm trying to say. And we'll say query selector, and then we're going to give it this, input name equals engine :checked. And that will go in and grab whichever one has been checked. And of course, if nothing has been checked, this will actually be undefined. So we can use that to our advantage later when we're doing the bonus mission with the validation to make sure something has been selected. So we have this representing this now. So let me find my mouse. There it is. Okay. So they tell us that we could use a, series of if-else statements to say, if this is the, engine, then set this, action URL variable to this. But that's not efficient. Instead, if you set up a object to store key value pairs with the value of the input itself as a string, and then give it the URL as its value in the key value pair, then we'll actually be able to just use whichever string is the value of that, of this object that we just set up with this, and say, if this is the one that's been selected, then that's the key that we're going to go access, and that should return whichever value we want for the URL. This is a very common way to do this sort of thing. So up here in the function, we don't even have to do it in the function. These are just static values. I could do it before the function. It doesn't matter as long as it's in scope. So I'm gonna do it ahead of the function because it's really just static data that we're gonna access as part of what we're doing in the function. So I'll say I want Google to be, this one, google.com/search. And then I'll put a comma and say DuckDuckGo. And it's very important that these keys be exactly the same as the values that we put on those input elements that you see down on lines 26 through 29. So I'm making sure that they're exactly the same. And then bing.com/search. Each of these have their own specific way of doing this. And then ask is going to be ask.com. Oops, I'm missing a W. Web. Okay. Good. So we have key value pairs for each one of those values, and that will give us that URL. So what we want to do inside of our function here is to go get the value. And actually, I can just go get the URL directly. Let's just do this. URL is going to be, and I'm going to go to actions, and I should have called this actions. I'm sorry. Let me fix that. Yeah, because we have multiple actions represented in here. So we're going to go to actions, and we're going to give it button selected dot value. This is going to just whichever one was checked, we're going to get the value from that and retrieve the URL that is associated with that value from the button as they are defined down here. Those have to correspond, and then it works as a key for this object, and then we will get the value back. So that's going to be the URL, and then we just have to set it. So they tell you can use set attribute. You can definitely do that. You can also set it directly. So I'm going to show you the other way to do it, which is just to say form.action equals URL. So this will make it as if there was actually an attribute here that said, action equals, some URL.com. So, but we can't hard code it. We're going to set it after the fact. So that's what we do here with this listener is, we call set search engine, it runs it, it finds which one has been checked. We go and get the correct URL from this object for that particular button. And then we set it on the form and set that action attribute to be that URL. Okay, so let's test this out and see what we've got so far. So I'm going to say, I'm going to search for launch code, and I'm going to choose, let's choose Bing and say go. And it did not work. It opened up another one here. Okay, so give me just a second here. Uncaught reference error, form is not defined. Form, oh, right, okay. This is important, So this is not going to be ready yet, because look what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to access the form. That object was defined down here in this load listener. It is not in scope for the search engine, set search engine function that is up here and referenced down here. So as long as this is a separate named function outside of this and they have completely separate scopes, it means that I actually need to have this in two different places, which, might seem a little bit redundant, but this is a fairly simple form. So I think it's fine. What I would ordinarily do is if I was going to define the function separately like this, I would define it inside the load listener so that I could only have this once. I would put it between these two, like, here. And that way it could use the same object without having to define it twice. But that's okay. This is the way we're going to do this. And so we just have to have this here so that it can access it from here as well as from here when it's, listening for the submit thing. So let's run this again. And I'll choose it again. And say go. There we go. And it opens up Microsoft Bing. Launch code is already the search term because of this, these query parameters here where Q is equal to launch code and engine is equal to Bing. We see right here, we get results. Now, if I close this and go back and change it and say, this time I want it to Google it, we'll say go. And now we have Google. And it provides its results the way that Google does. So this is working. This is great. This is all there is to this assignment until you get to the bonus missions. So we are actually done with the primary part of the assignment. So the first bonus mission wants us to add validation to the submit handler so that it won't try to submit unless they have something in that search term box and they also have selected a search engine. So there's a couple of different ways you could do this. The first way is the most straightforward. It might be what most of you would have chosen to do initially. So let's add some stuff in here. Let's say bonus mission part 1 and add validation. Okay. So the first way I would probably do this would be to say we could use a window alert. Okay, so we could just use alerts to give them the feedback, to let them know what it is that they still need to do in order to submit the form properly. Option 2 is actually to use boxes like an error box on the page, error text. I mean, you can format however you want. You don't need a box. It could just be text. Sometimes, they'll put just simple text right below the inputs or something like that. I'm going to do it with like a box that's like lower down on the page, and we'll use red text. That's pretty normal to do when you have an error message. So I'm going to do it each way so you kind of can see what the options are. The first one is more straightforward, but either way, whether we do option 1 or option 2, in order to provide this validation, not only do we need to be able to check and see if button selected has a value, something is in fact checked, we also need to access the query itself, the search term. So if you remember, that actually is the one that has the ID of Q. So we can go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say, and really, if I want, I could just kind of keep all my objects together up here. So I could say, const query equals document get element by ID and say Q. Okay. So this way we'll be able to check and make sure that this is not blank. So we kind of have a couple of different things here. Now, you might say we could say, if there is no search term, or if the button, there's no button selected, then, put an alert up. And we could do that, but the message would have to kind of cover all the bases. We would have to say, something like, you have to have something to search for and you have to select an engine. I'm going to choose to make it more specific. I'm going to say that the alert is going to have a different message depending on which is true. So I'm going to have two of these. I'm going to say if, and then I'm going to go to query, which is the box, the input for text, and say value. And then, so I'm looking in this to see if they put some sort of search term inside this Q box, right? What if they had a blank though? They could have just accidentally put a blank. So I want to say .trim to make sure that after that blank has been removed, we're comparing this correctly to an empty string. Just in case it was also a blank. Otherwise, I would have to do if query.value equals an empty string, or if query value equals a blank, or maybe there could be multiple blanks. Trim will take care of that. It's one of those useful string methods that helps us in situations like this. So we've trimmed it, and if we trim it and it has absolutely no characters, then we know that we need to put up an alert. So I'm going to say alert. You could also do window.alert here, it doesn't matter. And I'll say, oops, you didn't enter anything to search for. Okay. And that would be enough, except we also want to prevent it from submitting, right? So we need to use that event.prevent default so that the form will not submit. And then we need to do this again. So else if no value for button selected. So if we went to button selected to see which one of those was checked and it did not come back with anything, then we can just use that faulty, evaluation of not button selected. And then we can do something similar here. So I'm really just going to copy this and put it here. And we'll just change the message and say, oops, and then just select this properly. Let's say, which search engine do you want to use? Okay. So now we have a way of testing each of these. And this is a pretty straightforward way to do it. So let's go over and test it. Let's say I select Google, but I don't put anything in here, and I say go. All right, it pops up an alert. It says, oops, you didn't enter anything to search for. Let's test that again by putting some blanks in here so we know our trim is working. I'll say go, same thing. It took all the blanks away before it evaluated it. Okay, so now let's do the opposite, and I'm going to need to refresh the page here because we want all of these to be unselected. I'm going to put in a search term, but I'm not going to select this, and I'm going to say go. Now we get an alert that says, oops, which search engine did you want to use? Okay, so this is a pretty straightforward way to do this where you can have two different messages and be very specific about what the error is, which is good for user experience. This is where you want to make it very easy for your user to know exactly what it is that they did wrong. And this message that's coming up is just because the code continued down here, and it was trying to find, like it tells us if we go to line 31, it went to this and tried to find this value, and it couldn't find anything because we still had an error. And that's okay. It doesn't matter because the main thing is that it didn't submit, and that's what we wanted. We want it just to prevent them from doing that. So I'm going to now talk about option 2. And you know what? I just realized I put all of this under above here, and I meant to put it here. Okay, so that's option 1. Option 2 is to use an error box. So there's a couple more things that I would have to do here. First of all, I have to have the boxes exist before I can access them as JavaScript objects. So I'm going to come down here and add a couple more lines and say, bonus mission part 1, and this is option 2. This is the only thing we need this for, is the second option. I'm just going to create a simple div with the ID of error box. This is a shortcut, by the way, that you can use and do that. And then I'll do the same thing here where I'll do a P with the ID of error message. And I'm hitting the tab key to make that happen, by the way. Okay. So now we have, and I really don't actually need anything in here. We are going to provide the inner HTML for this. So I could just leave it like this and it's nice and clean. But nothing is hard coded. The other thing that's important about this, ultimately, we may want to use a little CSS to hide this and then only make it visible if there's a message, and otherwise we could, make it invisible again. That's not going to matter as much when we just have like a white page because you won't see it. But once I start adding some styling to this, we'll make sure to take care of that. All right, so now we need the actual JavaScript. So we have two IDs here to work with to identify these different elements. So let's go get objects for these. I'm going to first access the box itself and say const error box equals document dot get element by ID, and then give it error box. And then I'll do the same thing for the error message. And search for the ID error message. Okay, now we can access both of those. We really won't need the box until we add the CSS, but I'm creating it now anyway. So we need some logic, and we really could start with the same logic here because the conditions are the same, right? And let me go ahead and actually comment this out so that we don't have the alerts popping up and we just handle it this way now. So this is true, but we don't want an alert. Instead, we want to set this text as the value for the inner HTML of the error message paragraph element. So I'm going to go to that error message, and I'm going to say inner HTML equals. And that's a straightforward way to set that value. And then I can do the same thing down here and say error message dot inner HTML equals, and then just take off this parentheses down here from the alert. There we go. And either way, we still need, that prevent default to stop the form from submitting. So that part stays the same. Okay, so let's try this. Let's come over here and do it again. I will try it first by leaving this blank and choosing an engine and say go. And it says, oops, you didn't enter anything to search for. Good. Okay. So let's reset it. This time I'll have a search term, but fail to select a search engine and say go. And it says, oops, which search engine do you want to use? And then we get that error message, which is just behind the scenes. Don't worry about it. So we could then, say, okay, we're done with this part, right? And that's true. This is all pretty plain Jane though, right? There's absolutely no styling. So the second bonus mission is to add some CSS to the page to make it look nice. So I have a couple of things that I'm going to do. One is that I'm going to add an image for a background. I'm going to copy in a folder called images. And now you can see that since I handled this elsewhere, you can see this has just showed up, and we've got this, JPEG that's going to be in the background. The second thing I will do is to add a CSS file. So I'll just, and I don't want it there. Let me escape out of that. I want it down here. So there we go. And I'll just call this style.css. Okay, so this is bonus mission part 2. So you can see I've set some font family options here. I've got, but a number of things that just kind of handle this background image and how I want things to be aligned, some padding. I've got this Google font Pacifico that I'm using for a title, which I have not added in yet, but I will in a second. And then, some basic styling for a bunch of the other elements that we have in there. I'm going to have a way of styling the error message and the error box. And you can see that I've got this visibility set to hidden to start, which means we are going to need to add some code in to change that and make it visible, which is why I created an object to represent this box right here, because I'm going to need to do that. Let me put some space here. Okay. So first things first, let me start putting some things in place on the page that I've got some CSS for. I'm going to have a title above this section. I'm going to just put in that H1, and I'm just going to call this Needles from Haystacks. I'm going to give it its own little name. I came up with this when I was a student. So, you know, I'm just following what I did as a student. Okay, so form. And oh, I already have the form. Silly me. I'm going to put this inside a div so I kind of have a box for it. And I'm going to call it search bar. And that's in my CSS. There's some styling provided for it. And then I'm also going to have a little bit of like a subheader here that it has an ID of search header and just says search anywhere and everywhere. Okay. And then we've got the form, but I want the form to be up inside this box, so I'm going to move it up. Nope, right there. Okay. There we go. Okay. So I have a div inside it. I've got this text, and then I've got the form itself. And then down here, this error box is essentially styled to be a separate box that'll be below this on the page. The last thing I need to do is to connect in the head to some of this other stuff that I've got. So hang on just a second. I need my style sheet to be linked, and I also need a link for the Google font, Pacifico, that I'm pulling in for the title. So let me put that up here. I'm just gonna put it right up here above my script. And that should work. All right, so let's go over and take a look at what we've got. All right, so you can see we've got the search term here. We've got the different things. I need to make this a little wider, I think, because I've got this kind of big. Yeah, that looks better. All of these are still kind of in line by default. And so they tend to wrap if you have the screen be too small. That's the kind of thing when you learn how to do responsive design, you can control how that happens. And maybe at some point you would, when the screen gets small, you would actually just list them one after another on separate lines. All right, is there anything else I need to do here? The last thing that we need to do is actually make our error messages visible. So right now, if I try to submit this, we don't see the error messages pop up because as I showed you, that CSS has that error box visibility is hidden. So this is where we're going to go back in and add a little bit more logic into here to make sure that that visibility changes. All right, so I'm going to go first. We're going to set the message. This happens so fast, it kind of doesn't just, it doesn't matter which order you put these in, but you can always put it after to make it visible after the message has been placed. Access the style attribute and then access the property of visibility. And then I'm going to set that to be visible. Okay, and then I'll do the same thing here. It's the exact same thing. And then we're going to say if the user has actually seen this message and then they changed it and fixed it, we want it to go invisible again. So we're going to say if neither of those things were a problem, then let's just make sure that we have changed that visibility back. This is something that's easy to forget. You can say I've taken care of my validation so that this thing, you know, shows up and they see the error message. But, if they continue to work on this page, maybe they're coming back and they're going to search something new, that error message would still be there unless you remove it. So this is why we are adding one more condition here. Okay, so let's test it out. I'm going to say go. And the very first one it comes across is the fact that this is empty. You didn't enter anything to search for. So we say, okay, no problem. Put in launch code, hit go. Oops, which search engine did you want to use? And so then we can say, let's use ask and go. And so we get the results. And if we come back here, you'll see those error messages disappeared. That's exactly what we were going for. Okay, so I believe this is everything through the rest of the bonus missions there. I just, you can take a look at my code. You can go to the solution branch and you'll be able to see my CSS, kind of how I styled all of this. You'll be able to see some of the extra things that I did. Here are these two different options for handling the validation. And then, however you decided to do this, it can be done a lot of different ways. But hopefully this has helped you see just one way that it could be done.